Hello, and welcome to the History Center and our Carnegie Lecture on abalone diving on the central coast of California. Our speaker this evening is Steve Rebuck. He was born on Santa Catalina Island, where his dad fished abalone and albacore after having spent 8 years in the US Army during World War II. His family moved to Morro Bay in 1955, where his dad continued abalone and albacore fishing. As a teenager, Steve learned the basics of heavy gear diving, technology, heavy gear diving, canvas suits, and helmets. In the early 1960s, Steve observed sea otters, which in a few short years eliminated commercial abalone diving in the Morro Bay region. After serving in the California National Guard for 6 years and working in the private sector, Steve returned to abalone as a consultant to the commercial abalone fleet, by then operating out of Santa Barbara. This led to 4 appearances before Congress on the Marine Mammal Protection Act and Endangered Species Act. Steve continued to dive abalone until 1997, when the state of California closed abalone fishing south of San Francisco. And so, with no further ado, the star of the hour, please welcome Steve Rebuck. Thank you.
Well, good evening, folks. I see a lot of old friends in the audience here tonight. Thank you all for being here. I had the great good fortune to grow up in the abalone business and started diving when I was 9 years old, and it was a wonderful thing. Abalone are 25% protein, 2% fat, and very healthy food. All the divers I grew up with lived far into their 90s and lived very healthy. So I've been working real hard the last few years to bring it back where the public will have access to it again. It's not easy to deal with government agencies, but we're trying real hard. So with that introduction, I had a question for Thomas before we begin. How many Carnegie libraries are there in the United States? Do you know? It's a wonderful building. Yeah. Oh, he did. Okay. Well, we'll ask him later. Well, growing up in Morro Bay, they used to put me on the bus with the San Luis kids for sports and wrestling and swimming. And so I got to know a lot of kids over here. And so I decided in high school, when I decided to settle down and raise a family, and my bride here, Frances, I decided long ago I was going to live in San Luis Obispo. So that's what we did. We raised 3 children here. The downside is it's a little difficult to live here now because it's so expensive, but it's a wonderful city. Okay, let's see. I get going here. Now this first image, this is a little unusual. This is a 1953 Pontiac Chieftain. When I was a little kid, we had moved to Morro Bay, or to Ocean Beach near San Diego in 1951. And the diver that my dad was working for at the time, Jerry Todd, was from Texas. And as you can see, he is a very stylish man. He had one of these cars. And one day we were going out to what's called Shelter Island near the entrance of San Diego Harbor. And with Mr. Todd driving, I was in the back seat. We stopped at one of the boat yards, and this young guy came crawling out from underneath a boat, all covered with sawdust. And so Mr. Todd asked him, he says, "Well, who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm Laddie Handelman. I'm from New York, and I'm looking for my Uncle Jimmy Brogg. He's an abalone diver." So Mr. Todd said, "Yeah, we know Jimmy." He says, "Get in the back seat with Steve, and we'll drive you over to him." And so that was the first time I had met Laddie Handelman, who at the time, he was 17 and I was 7. And we became lifelong friends. But anyhow, it was in this automobile, pretty nice car. Okay, this photo here, this is Laddie Handelman. As far as I can tell, this looks like out towards Montana de Oro. along the coast there. I don't know about the buildings. I might be wrong about that. There's too many buildings. But this is Laddie. He's probably about 20 years old. You can see a big smile on his face. And he's in my book in several different locations. When the Sea Otters took over Morro Bay in the early 60s, a lot of the young guys like Laddie moved to Santa Barbara and started diving down there. And later on, he started a diving company called Oceaneering International. It's based in Houston, Texas. It on the New York Stock Exchange trades at about $1 billion a year. They are currently working on the spacesuits and helmets for the trip to Mars. And you think about this fellow never finished high school, but they knew how to work hard. Diving is really hard work. The water's cold. You wear layers of woolen underwear and sweatshirts. We used to remember go down to the Goodwill and buy every sweater you could find that was wool. And you might wear 5 of them at a time while you're diving to keep warm. But that's Laddie on the ladder. Wonderful man. This is another couple. I never could figure out how my parents were both from Minnesota, how they ended up at Santa Catalina Island. Well, my dad had been in the OSS during World War II. And I found out later that there was a debriefing center for the troops at Toyon Bay to get them back into society after the war. And he started working with Al and Norma Hansen here. Now, Al, he'd worked at the Hayward shipyards building Liberty ships during the war. And he bought some old diving gear because they were losing tools and big sheets of steel would fall overboard. And so he bought some gear, and on the weekends, he'd go dive up the tools and they'd give him a few bucks for his effort. But he really liked diving, even though he was from the Midwest. And his partner at the time was Barney Clancy. And Barney also from the Midwest. And after the war, they relocated to Cambria and started diving and processing abalone at Cambria. And then a couple of years after that, they moved down to Santa Catalina and Barney to Wilmington. And Norma here, this was Al's wife. Now, Al had a guy working in his shop that apparently stole quite a lot of abalone. Just loaded up his truck and drove away one day, but he left his wife, Norma. So Al would frequently say, it was the best money I ever lost, because he got Norma out of the deal. She at one time was the world's deepest diving woman. Wonderful lady. I did an oral history interview with her a few years ago for a historical diving society. This is an early picture of what's called the Black Fleet at Morro Bay. This was Barney Clancy's fleet of boats. He generally had 5 boats, and he painted them black and red. You'd get the paint at the war surplus, and people used to refer to them, it was like the Hells Angels coming to town because they were so proficient at what they did. They really sacked up the abalone. I asked Barney about it one time, and he said, yeah, I had the boats, each boat was on a 200 dozen per week quota. I said, well, how'd you come up with that number? He goes, well, that's all I could process. That's 1,000 dozen. And this was back when it was a 9-inch abalone. So it was, excuse me, I take that back, it was an 8-inch abalone. Thank you, Pete, I heard that.
No tall tales.
Oh, there's a similar picture. You can see the boats. Now this one here, that little boat there belonged to one of the other families that fished Morro Bay, the Montgomerys. And a gentleman named Bob Kirby bought that boat. Bob was just out of the U.S. Navy. And I used to call him the Black Fleet wannabe because he wasn't really part of that fleet, but he liked it so much he painted his boat to match. You can see the name of these boats here, the Lorraine W and the Whirlaway, and they all had really colorful names. Mostly they were just pleasure boats that were reconverted for commercial use. Now there's another one at Morro Bay. The Kathy is one of the new arrivals, and they're just launching it there. That's at the little kiddie park there on the way out to Morro Rock. I don't think you can do that today. This boat here is one of my favorites in the fleet. Anybody here been to the D-Day Museum in New Orleans? Fran and I went there several years ago. It's on the footprint of the Higgins boat factory from back World War II. Andrew Jackson Higgins built 10,000 boats during World War II. Hitler had a contract out on him. He called him the Noah of the ocean. Now this one here is called a Higgins Eureka. This was designed and built before World War II. These boats were used in the Mississippi River for logging. Higgins was a lumberman. He had a lumber yard in New Orleans, and he saw the war coming, so he started buying mahogany and building boats for the war effort. These boats could run over logs. They're extremely durable, and there was a couple of them in the dive fishery around here. This one is named Jean's Folly. My mother took this picture in 1956. That's me and my sister Susan, and that's the Black Fleet in the background. And that's 1956 is the year I started diving. Mr. Handelman gave me a brand new Voight mask one year. I found it in the back seat of his car. And I put it on, and he gave it to me. And once I could see underwater, then I wasn't afraid anymore. I started diving at 9, started diving abalone at about 12 or 13, because there was still abalone in Morro Bay at the time. Now, this was Lad Handelman again later on with Cal Dive. He's in a recompression chamber here. You can see he's still dressed in his gear. He and another diver named Danny Wilson, 1962, did the first 400-foot dive on mixed gas off of Santa Barbara. First time ever that had been done. The U.S. Navy had experimented with dive tables for those depths, but never perfected it. And this group of divers in the early 60s figured out how to do it. And Laddie made a joke with Phillips Petroleum that, well, if we do the dive, we get the contract. And Phillips laughed, and yeah, sure, they got the contract. It's a diving equipment salvage company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We're still in business. This kind of gear is still being made for construction and bridge building and such. This one has plexiglass lights, they're called, the little windows, and they screw in, so a little more convenient for abalone diving. Some of the other helmets that were used, mostly a lot of the Japanese and then the Greek helmets were also used because they were lighter in weight. Navy Mark V kind of has the reputation, but it's a very heavy helmet. And these helmets weighed up to 10 pounds less. Plus the part that fits on your chest here, the breastplate, is a little more curved outward, and so it doesn't press into your chest when you're leaning forward and diving. Now, just to show you some really big abalone shells here, this is I think the image is a little distorted, but that's probably about a 12-inch abalone. That's the inside of it.
What year was that?
Oh, This is probably, see, was taken on the North Coast. They closed that fishery, the state closed the fishery 2017. So it would have been prior to that. This is another friend of mine from Santa Barbara, Matt Lum. He's a financial advisor, but avid diver. This one's just short of 11 inches. You can see that it's about 10 pounds of meat in there. That's a really nice one. And then this is the last of the slides I was going to show. I wanted to mention the Pierce family, which they started fishing abalone around here in 1928. And this is one of their boats that they fished out of Morro Bay. They saw the sea otter coming in the 60s, and so they relocated down to Santa Barbara. The Pierce brothers and then some of the Brebs family from Morro Bay, they were diving gelenium for the war effort. Gelenium was used, the common name is auger, and it was used for night blindness for pilots. And it was really hard to find and collect. And so this group of divers from Morro Bay went down to Southern California in heavy gear, dove very shallow water, harvesting gelenium. And then within a few years, there was a substitute, an artificial product that was created. But the way I read the literature is that the Department of Fish and Game allowed the Pierce and these other divers to begin fishing the Channel Islands, which had been closed to diving. And I saw it kind of as a gift for their donation to the war effort. Yep, I guess that's the last one there. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the shells.
Wow.
This one got some attention earlier. This is a 3D printed shell. I find that children this big know exactly what it is. People our age is like, what's that? I'll pass it around, but the largest shell found in California is about this size. Just kind of why I had it made this big, just so you kind of for reference.
Thank you.
Now, this shell here, this is a common red abalone. I found this in a shell pile out by the inn at Morro Bay. There used to be huge piles of shells around this area. What's unique about this one is the stripes on it. These are called dietary tags. They're caused by the food, the various types of kelp that the animals eat. And it lays down color, different, white, green, blue, red, brown, different colors of the kelp. This one is a white abalone. It's on the endangered species list, Haliota sorencini. We're trying to get another name added to that is for Roy Hatoy, who is a Japanese diver from Monterey. He was the first one to find these, and they were named by a scientist named Sorensen after himself. But we're trying to add Hatoy to the name. It's kind of a long process to do that, but they're really beautiful animals, very deep water, out to 200 feet of water. This one is a pink abalone. It's a Southern California species, not found north of Point Conception. These were very common, though. I found some of these shells at Morro Bay that were being trucked up and processed at Morro Bay over the years.
So it looks more green than pink.
Good point.
Why not a green abalone?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's because this is a green abalone.
Okay, well then, does that mean that's pink inside?
No,
Okay.
I don't know where the name came from,
Okay.
but this is a green abalone, it's Haliotis fulgen. These are another Southern California species. This is one of the more prettier ones. This is from around this area. This is Haliotis assimilis. And they're, these beautiful colors on the back of the shell. These were found up around north of Cayucas and Point Estero area.
It had a more varied diet.
Excuse me,
I
ma'am?
said it had a more varied diet. You were pointing out that the color on the outside frequently has to do with what they've been eating.
You really pay attention, don't you? Are you a teacher?
No.
Oh, well, very
Just
good point.
interested.
Very good point.
Do any of these abalones get big?
Yeah, so yeah, the red abalone is the largest variety in the world. And they get up over 12 inches. Now, I'll show you the assimilis again for a reason. This is a pinto abalone, it's Haliotis campcachana. These are found all the way up to Alaska. And for about the last 20 years, this was considered to be a subspecies of this. I didn't buy that at the time, and I still don't, but I'm finding now in the literature that they've gone back separating these two individual species. Now, this one is probably the smallest variety that's found in this county and northward. This is Haliotis wallensis, is a flat abalone. There's a picture of one in my book that's in a piece of rock that I found at Cayucas. And I had a geologist recently tell me that that rock is 4 million years old. And I thought, well, this doesn't appear to be fossilized, nor does the one that is in the rock. I'll explain a little bit more about how the shells are made. And lastly, this is a black abalone, Haliotis crackerodii, wonderful name. Probably many of you have seen these around. These used to be very common. Pete tells me that in some areas they're back. This is on the Endangered Species Act, but they're common again on some of the Channel Islands as well. You can go on the National Park Service site and find the locations. Now, this one, I brought this one to tell you about how the animals make the shell. There's a recent, still pretty theoretical about how they do this, but a gentleman named Dr. Jeremy Prince from Australia wrote a recent paper called Shellology. And apparently what happens with these animals, I'm going to pass this around because it's pretty neat. Now, what these animals do when they're grazing various types of kelp, they're ingesting minerals at the same time. And those minerals are dissolved into their blood and then pumped around inside the animal. And they lay down, and this is called nacre, this shiny part. There's 3 parts of the abalone shell. And this is the inner part of it. And so they lay down these layers of shell, kind of like the way that 3D printed shell is made. It's actually made very similar in that it lays down layer after layer of plastic. So instead, these animals are laying down layer after layer of mineral, and that's why my abalone that I found in a piece of rock is still just a shell, because it's already a mineral. It's kind of an interesting thing. I've not quite digested the theory on this yet, but there's a lot of work going on in abalones.
Is there a theory about how old the shell is that was found in the rock?
No, it's a wall of lenses, so it's a little larger than this, but they only get up to about 5 inches in size. That would be a really big one. Generally, you find them. This one was found down at I think Pirates Cove the last couple of years, so they're still around. They're pretty thinned out. You got to know how to find them.
How do you find them?
My secret weapon is a flashlight.
At low tide?
Yeah, generally, yeah, I like to short pick. I took my kids out and taught my kids to dive on the North Coast. They were too young when the fishery was closed, and then the North Coast was still open. So we'd go up there. Problem is, it's just such a long ways to go. It takes a day to get up there and a day to get back. You got to stay in a hotel. And it's way more difficult than just driving here down to the beach. I was a little spoiled, I think. So I think with that, how about, before we go to questions, how many people here have been abalone diving? Okay, so a few. So that's a problem for me, is that the fishery was closed down here in 1997. So we've actually raised now a generation that doesn't know anything about it. They think it was all fished out, which isn't supported by the scientific literature. It's a little more complex than that. But, it disturbs me that so many people have no real knowledge of something so important. Because I look at Morro Bay, for example. Abalone built Morro Bay. I was telling Thomas a story yesterday about one of my friends who, he died a few years ago, but he was playing poker one night with some guys in Morro Bay. And he kept getting up and looking at the house across the street. And finally somebody said, what's Charlie doing? How come he's looking at that house? And somebody said, oh, he lost that house in a poker game. These guys started fishing during the Depression. But that's how valuable the abalone fishery was, that a guy could lose a house in a poker game. It's kind of startling. So with that, I think I'd entertain questions. Sir?
Just heard about the arrival of the sea otters.
Yes.
And I just wondered, you said they closed in 1997 here. Was that because of the arrival of the sea otters decimating them? And if so, did they just migrate down, or and what have they done to try and reestablish the abalone here?
Well, that's a troubling question for me. The evidence is pretty clear. You go back to Edna Fisher, who was a scientist. 1939 was the first one to publish about sea otters in abalone, and she was the one that predicted the conflict that would arise between the Japanese divers of Monterey and the sea otter. 1939. So go to Ebert in the 60s. Dan Gottschall did baseline studies at Diablo Canyon, which are some of the best documentation, because Gottschall and his team captured before, during, and after sea otters. Before being, that was the last spot that was fished out of Morro Bay in the early 70s. And by mid 70s, it was pretty much gone. Otters had arrived, and they eat abalone down to just a couple inches in size, about 3 inches. So they go through them pretty quick. And there's really no debate. The literature is pretty clear. Sir?
So they had, before man came, white guys, there were just Indians here. There was equilibrium between the otters. There was otters and there was abalone. And also, I think you would have to agree with that. But then what do you think about the abalone farm? Well,
first, the abalone farms are only access to abalone these days, and I support them. They're very difficult because of the Coastal Act to get established.
What species do they raise?
Primarily red abalone. Yeah. Be this one. And then about the balance between the Indians and abalone and sea otters. If you go way back in the literature and look, the early hunting records at Monterey where Indians were snaring sea otters on land.
On land.
Yes, it's a land animal. Now, whether the hunting had influence on them going back into the ocean, nobody was collecting data back there in the Indian days, so it's not really a lot known about those details. Years ago, I was friends with Dr. Charles Woodhouse from the Natural History Museum in Santa Barbara. He was a trained marine mammologist. He was the first one to tell me about the hunting on land of the sea otter with snares and clubs. And that goes back to, I think the first publication on that was in the 1700s. So even around here, about 20% or more of the sea otters haul out at night. So they do show some influence on being a land animal. In Alaska currently, they've got an issue going on with wolves preying on sea otters, and wolves don't go in the ocean, so they're hunting them on land. So it's a curious thing. There's just not a lot known about that history. Ma'am.
Are the different species, do they prefer different depths? You mentioned 200 feet for the white abalone, so are the others at different depths?
Yes, they are. The black abalones like this are typically up in the splash zone, right up. I used to fish them at Cayucas starting from the 60s, and I could still get my limit in 1997 when the fishery was closed. But the limit at that point had gone down to 2. But I was finding them like this, using my flashlight, secret weapon. Sir.
The man who introduced you said that abalone, taking abalone now below San Francisco south, you can't do it anymore? And what about off the Channel Islands?
No, the whole state is closed from San Francisco to Mexico since 1997.
Permanently?
Well, that's an interesting question. We've been challenging the state on that one because they called the closure at the time a moratorium. In case law, a moratorium is 2 years. 5 years would be a long time. It's been 28. So it's not really a moratorium. It's a property taking. I've got some attorneys investigating this currently. Ma'am.
Okay, so I too am from Minnesota, so
Oh, lovely.
I don't understand. I remember reading how Indians would harvest and pound the meat and cook it. Could you explain to me what is the lure of eating abalone?
Oh.
I'm sorry, I don't know a thing about
It's very yummy.
The lure of
how you eat abalone.
Of eating?
Tough? Is it you peel it
Oh.
out? How do you harvest it out of the shell? You cut it?
Crowbar.
Very good questions. Okay. Yeah, it's a mussel.
Okay.
And so it sucks down onto the rock in the wild state. The diver uses a pry bar, which the metal of choice has always been a automotive leaf spring because it's so durable. I find them every year. I usually find one at the flea market, and I've got a large collection of them. But they're very common. Or used to be more common, but I still occasionally find one. But yeah, you have to pry them off the rock, and then the pounding. I'll go through the whole process. Once they're in the processing facility or in your home, you take that bar and you push the meat out of the shell from the inside, pry it out, and then typically when they're processing, they would put it on a table overnight to relax the meat. And then the pounding of it, they'll slice the meat into about, say, 1/4 to 1/2 inch slices. And then the pounding isn't so much to tenderize it is to shock the tissue. into relaxing. So the pounding is necessary to make it palatable. And then cooking is originally when the Chinese started fishing 1850 up at Monterey area, they would take the meat and they would put it out in the sun and let it dry. And the animals would shrink up about 1/5 of their previous size because all the moisture comes out of it. Then they would sack up those biscuits, we'd call them, and put them in gunny sacks and ship them over to the Orient. And then the flavor of abalone is kind of like scallops. If you've ever had really good scallops, that's probably the closest I could suggest the flavor would be. Does that answer your question? Yes, ma'am. Sure.
I lived in Australia for 20 years, and they still allow abalone fishing in Western Australia. But the question I have is, since 1960, there have been 28 fatal shark attacks, and 20 of them have been in the hunting and processing of seafood in the beds. So I'm just wondering, what is that common here to lose abalone fishers to sharks?
Yes, it is. Yeah. I saw my first great white up at San Simeon, probably late 50s sometime, 58 or so. And it was feeding on a dead whale. So we drove over just to look at it. And the shark was down probably around 20 feet. I had a death grip on that boat, man. I was scared to death. But yeah, I've had a couple of friends killed by great whites. Jimmy Robinson was a diver out on the Channel Islands, wonderful guy. He was the kind of guy that if somebody broke down, he'd stop fishing and tow them back to Santa Barbara. He's just a wonderful guy. But he got bit in half by one about 25 years ago. And so it did happen occasionally. The divers, there's some islands off of San Francisco called the Farallones. There was about 20 guys that worked out there. The thing about diving the Farallones was they didn't have any competition. Sport divers wouldn't go out there. Very treacherous. And a lot of them carried on their wetsuits, they would have a holster sewn in the wetsuit right here, and they carried Glocks. There was one of the divers that had been a tunnel rat in Vietnam, and he was a gunsmith. So he'd modify the weapons so they shoot underwater. But I talked to him about it one time, and he said, yeah, but when you pull the trigger, make sure your head's above the surface, because a concussion would really put the hurt on you too. So
I have a question.
Yes, Steve, remind me if my memory is correct, that when my brother Larry, who you remember way back when we were diving, when I first started diving, and I was 9, 10 years old as well, off at Titus Point in Cambridge. But as I remember, and we get the blacks real close, Larry would go out deeper to get the reds. But we back then never saw sea otters that I can remember of. Rarely. In 1965, say. So I mean, can you remember what was the population of the sea otters then? I know they were in Monterey, but how prolific were they in the middle 60s or in the 60s in the Central Coast here?
okay, well, that's a good question. I saw my
Yeah,
first
let's go back
in
before that.
1957 from an abalone boat up at San Simeon. And the diver at the time, George Cormetis, his nickname was George the Greek. He was from Tarpon Springs, Florida, had been a sponge diver, came out here to dive abalone. And there was other abalone guys who went back and dove sponge on the East Coast, Florida. I've been down there. But what he was bringing up were eviscerated abalone, meaning that the otter would break a hole in the shell and they would relish the innards, the guts of the animal, and they would discard the foot, the meat that we were harvesting. And so we were bringing up and finding these abalone that were dying. They're still alive, but not for long. So that was 57. Now, one of the things that happens when a herd of otters comes through an area and fairly well depletes it, the male animals move on. They become what's called a migrant front. And they typically leave 1 or 2 females for linear part of, coast, part of the coast, linear mile of coast. And so those 1 or 2 females was to kind of keep everything groomed down. So you can imagine if there's only 1 per mile, how difficult that would be to see. And see things like at Morro Bay now, there's areas at Morro Bay, you can go out there by the restaurants and see a little herd of them, 10 or 15 at a time. I don't know what they're eating. I started diving there 70 years ago, and there's not much left, but they find something. I do see occasionally starfish missing arms. Starfish is their least preferred food item. So when they're eating starfish, they're pretty driven by hunger. Tom?
Yeah, what's happening with the old Alexander farm and the Abalone farm in Cayucas, north of Cayucas? That's the first question. Second question is, why are there the holes in the road on all the shells?
Oh, okay. First question, I'll answer the second question first. Those are breathing apertures, and then they also spawn through those holes. So when they're gravid and spawning, the animals release their egg and sperm through those holes. But then their gill is on the inside, and so they breathe through those holes as well. And then the first question was?
What's happening with the old Abalone?
Oh, yeah, John Alexander was a dear friend. Wonderful man. I went to his wake when he died, and I think the family were trying to do something with that property because he owned the land. He had his home there, and beautiful little kind of a double wide was a temporary home, but I think I'm really not sure. I've tried to go out there. Gate seems to always be locked. I've heard different stories about, well, maybe they're going to do it again, or maybe, I don't know. The problem is that it's grandfathered in before the Coastal Act, so it can't be replicated. And trying to get through the Coastal Commission, I worked with another group in Morro Bay years ago trying to build a facility down by Guadalupe. They went bankrupt before they could do anything. They just couldn't get through the Coastal Commission. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So it's not,
No.
so the farm is not operative right now?
As far as I know, not. I really don't know. I wish I did.
I was up to that Abalone farm, which is north of Cayucas. I saw on the news or something somewhere that anybody else knows anything about. They wanted to start seaweed farm. Some folks are planting seaweed or harvesting seaweed up there.
Okay.
That was one of the rumors that I had heard. China has a huge kelp growing process, been going on for years. This state is just so stodgy. It's hard to get them moving. And if we were to replicate that Chinese model, it would be really wonderful. But again, the state is really difficult to work with. I've had 2 petitions for regulatory change to try and get abalone open again. Some areas of the coast now, they're dying of old age and they just won't let us fish. And it's not even an issue of the health of the population. They don't seem to care about that. I was at Mammoth Springs back in June appearing on this subject, and they don't even ask questions about the resource. They're using my own words against me. It's not a very friendly group. Yeah, go ahead, man.
Are there male and female abalone?
Yes, there are. And there's only 2 sexes. I don't think they've gone trans yet. So.
I can remember.
Well, go ahead, man. That's all
I
right.
opened abalone and there was a sac, and that was supposed to be the reproductive sac. That's inside. There's a foot, and then there's a sac.
Yeah, there's a gonad, and they're different colors. That's how you can sex the animals. Sir?
So I was just gonna
Oh,
mention
man.
real quick on just as a seaweed side, some people may not know this, but there's certain types of seaweed that if you rub it, you can feel it's kind of slimy. So it's harvested by some companies, this company called Kelco. It's an alginate, and that is a food gum that's used as a thickener in many kinds of foods. So if people are wondering why are they trying to grow certain types of seaweed, it can be for a harvest for food gums.
Yeah, the kelp canopy, the Macrocystis and Nereocystis, the two varieties are the most common. The ones that float on the surface that are dark brown color. Those things, they can grow like the Macrocystis grows up to 3 feet a day. And so they only take the very top of that plant. I've seen the harvester down at Avalon Beach in the last few years. So there are some areas that are still being harvested for that reason. Yeah, it is a very good food additive. And for the abalone now, see, the government tends to look for that surface canopy, the plant growing on the surface, and they fly over and they say, well, there's no canopy, so there's no abalone. Well, that's not correct, because abalone can feed on the understories species that are growing on the bottom. And because when there's no canopy on the surface, there's more sunlight penetration to the bottom. And so those plants do really well, and the abalone do really well on them. But trying to educate government biologists that have master's degrees, I've got 77 years of experience, but I don't have a degree in anything. And I've managed to get before the U.S. Congress and debate some of the best people in the country on these subjects. And, it's a wonderful thing. We live in a wonderful country where regular folks like us can go do things like that. I'm trying real hard to get back before the Congress currently, but it's like with these white abalone that grow out to 200 feet. In their juvenile phase, they can be found right on the beach in 5 feet of water. I told that to a PhD scientist a few years ago. She just blew me off. She didn't care. And I talked to another friend of mine, Buzz Owen, who's a published author on the subject. He says, yeah, I told her the same thing, and she blew me off too. So a lot of times these people, they work so hard to get their education, but to get another point of view and sideways is almost impossible. That's the one criticism I have of academia. They're pretty closed-minded, and often government as well. Sir?
I have a question. On abalone's lifetime, how far can they move from where they're spawned? Do they go to the gastropods? So they're usually stuck on something, aren't they?
Yeah, you find on the reef structure where they're located, they typically leave what's called a scar on the rock, meaning they've been there so long, there's nothing there. It's just a big blank spot.
Where they're born, they just move.
Well, they're born. That's another interesting subject. What happens when they spawn out and they're floating around in the plankton, they can live up to 3 weeks. When they settle out, they've come in contact with what's called coral and algae. If you're familiar on the beach, sometimes you'll see this purple color to the substrate, to the rock. Well, that's a type of algae. There's an articulated version of it that's got moving parts. And then there's other varieties. They're just like a pavement of purple on the rock. But they release an amino acid. And so when these planktonic animals come in contact with that amino acid, it triggers their shell growth. And the weight of that shell causes them to settle to the bottom. And then they start grazing on diatoms first, and then soon after on kelp, different varieties of kelp. So that's kind of how they, settle out and start growing. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, sir?
Worldwide, where do you find abalone?
Oh, good one. All over the world. There are some in France, I think there's at least one variety that's extremely rare in Florida, South America. South Africa has a big fishery. Japan, again, now currently has a wild abalone fishery, as does Australia and New Zealand. My good friend Mike Radden, that built the Radden boats, immigrated to New Zealand about 25 years ago. He owns an old whaling station down near Picton, and he has an abalone farm there where he grows abalone for meat and the pearls.
Wow.
But he's got abalone growing on his dock right there at his home. You know.
Abalone pearls, that's something.
Oh yeah, they're very valuable. Yeah, and that's the jewelry market for the shells, buttons, and things. I recently found a shirt in a trash can, and I was looking at it and it had abalone buttons on it. So I removed the buttons and put the shirt back in the trash can.
I was an artistic woodworker, and I used abalone shells to put inlays into the handles of the drawers.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, I found out it was a neurotoxin, the dust.
Oh, very hot. Yeah, very dangerous. Yeah, can kill you within a couple of weeks of breathing the dust. You want to wear a really good one. Yeah, really protect yourself.
Yeah, Steve, how about no, just what he's saying that I remember the Nagano property, Morro Bay and other places, the huge abalone piles, right? And what were they doing with the abalone shells agriculturally?
Well, nothing that I know of other than maybe putting plants in them occasionally for decoration, but they were just kind of randomly parked in different parts of Morro Bay and Cayucas and Cambria over the years. My dad calculated one time that when those piles went away for buttons and other things, they were sold for more than the divers originally got for the whole animal. Back in the 50s and 60s, they were getting 50 cents a piece for them. So about $6 a dozen. When the fishery closed in 97, the divers in Santa Barbara were getting $50 a piece. And I advised the Department of Fish and Game at the time that, okay, the day after that day after the closure, they'll hit $100. And they did. They were being poached and traded for heroin in San Francisco, for one thing. But having the fishery, having legitimate people on the grounds is the best protection that those abalone could have, because people have a vested interest in preserving them. And we haven't been able to do that. The state right now is estimating poaching in California $24 million a year. And yet they won't let legitimate people go fish. To me, they're supporting the criminals.
When you say fish for abalone, what does that actually mean?
Well, fishing is a generic term. A sea lion eating salmon is fishing, technically.
So it's just harvesting by hand?
Just harvesting, yeah, for food. Yes, sir. Yeah.
After the hard hats that you showed, they had a lot of people dove for abalones and they just used a tank with a hose and some air up on the boat.
Well, in the law, you have to stay attached to your boat when you're commercial diving. And so they use the same type of compressor that the heavy gear divers used and a similar hose, but the system is called hookah. They use a scuba regulator that's attached to your weight belt, and then there's another tube that comes up to the regulator. And so it's basically free diving with unlimited air. You got a compressor and then typically a 25 gallon reserve tank that fills up with air. So you got a reserve in case the compressor shuts off. Way in the back. That's you, sir. Yeah.
How big an industry was it? Like how many people were involved? How much money was involved? How many tons of?
Okay, good question. Fishery started, the native people fished thousands of years ago. I met a gentleman, Dr. Todd Braid. He's an anthropologist from San Diego State. I donated about half of my research library to him a few years ago. But he's written some wonderful papers. One that got my attention was titled 5,000 Years of Abalone Fishing at San Miguel Island. San Miguel Island is Santa Barbara County. It's the one when you go south, when you get to Gaviota, it's that first island you see offshore. I've been out there quite a lot over the years. But I think that the fishery peaked probably around 5 million pounds a year. But back then they were getting 25 cents a piece for them. You know, so the numbers have changed over time. But when the fishery closed in '97, the commercial component was down around 200,000 pounds a year. The sport divers were picking in the range of 3+ million pounds. So the rhetoric about the commercial divers taking them all, it doesn't stand up to the literature, the documentation. Pete?
You know, you got to figure like in the 30s with the abalone, and I know most about abalone, but not only did you have mechanics working on the boats, shipyards building the boats and repairing them, all kinds of supplies, bars, bunch of bars, because the abalone divers, usually when they're not diving, get drunk. And so Avila and Morro Bay was saved during the Great Depression by abalone diving. That's the bottom line.
I agree, Pete. Yeah, it was a big moneymaker for the community, and still could be. You know, I've been working with Santa Barbara County the last couple of years on this, and I estimated the value of the fishery. If we could get back in, the commercial component would be worth about $4 million a year. That's with multipliers. About directly to the divers, about $1.5 million. So I just did an assessment on about 10 divers who, in between 1990 and 97, a person entering the fishery could buy 2 permits, retire 1, and take a test, enter the fishery. But to do that, they were spending $10,000 to $15,000 per permit, total $20,000 to $30,000. A boat costs anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000. Then their dive gear, another $5,000 to $10,000. Compressor setup, another $10,000. Trailer, $2,000 to $10,000. Then you got slip fees, and you gotta have a truck, and you gotta pay for a slip or a parking. You know, it's really an expensive enterprise. So the state encouraged this group of 10 people to enter the fishery, make just in a round number, $100,000 investment as a small businessman. And then within 5 years, they closed the fishery. Those guys lost most of their investment. Plus, they had to pay their crew, buy fuel. A dive boat gets about 1 mile per gallon. So guys today that are diving sea urchin, for example, they leave Santa Barbara, go to San Miguel Island. They're putting $1,000 in the fuel tank before they even leave town, before they catch 1 fish.
I've got a question.
Sure.
When they process the abalone for canning, I assume this is not like when they can tuna or what?
Yeah, they are. You can still buy them. Mexico sells canned abalone. Yeah, yes.
I've never seen it.
It's. I think we have one in our pantry. You know, I'm a little scared to open it.
In Hawaii, they're starting to can abalone. Also, a guy gave me a can of abalone from Hawaii. It's the latest thing.
Oh, well, I understand. I had my daughter go to Costco, and the Costco here doesn't have them, but recently they've had 3 green lip New Zealand abalone in a package for $25, and you get the shells.
Wow.
In the shell.
How big
Yeah.
are they, like about that big?
I don't know. They're probably not very big. But they probably taste good. Sir, back.
Steve, are there abalone in Baja, and if so, what's the condition of the abalone?
Yeah, Mexico has a fishery. I don't understand what's wrong with California these days. It's just can't seem to do anything right. I advised this guy recently. There's a group called the Ocean Protection Council got a hold of me recently, and I told him, I said, Fish and Game is kind of run like the LA Fire Department, Man,
So these are cold and warm water animals.
well,
Apparently, they live in
temperate.
Hawaii and Japan and our
There's certain depth in Hawaii where the water's really cold. That's where they're raising them.
Yeah, they're farmed in Hawaii.
At a great depth.
Yeah, and it's warmer in Japan, but as Pete's saying, they're at a deeper depth and where the water's colder. Yeah.
When I was at the abalone farm up in Cayucas, they only raised abalones to about this size because they sold them back east. And that was the size that they would buy at the restaurants. But the only way, they have a big tank and full of seaweed in there. And the only way they could tell there was an abalone in there was it would leave a trail as it ate through, as it was growing, because they apparently start out the size of a pinhead or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're very small when they settle out on the substrate. They're, like size of a pinhead. Pretty hard to see. But they, depending on food. Now, some years, like when we have the major El Nino cycle, they don't grow. In 1959, the state lowered the size limit from 9 to 8. Excuse me, I keep saying 9. From 8 inches to 7 3/4. For that reason, so they could maintain the fishery. Back then, they were on our side. But I keep saying 9 inches for some. I think it's because we've been proposing to the state that if the fishery was to reopen, we'd like to fish them at a larger size. But that's still in debate.
So a 9-inch abalone, how long would it take to reach this?
They will grow, if there's food in cold water, about 1 inch a year. So say 10 to 20 years for a legal abalone. Factoring in El Ninos and other cycles.
What year would you say it peaked, the abalone market, and then the current market price of abalone?
Yeah, about $100 a pound.
I know the one in Cayucas used to sell it back in the early 2000s for $150.
Wow. Well, see, I was still able to dive, so I didn't.
And yeah, it was small.
Yeah.
You got to keep the shell, right?
Yeah, at the abalone farm up north in Cayucas, they had mountains of shells. And they just said, look, just take all you want. So I packed my pockets full of them, but they were all small shells because that was the size that they like to sell back east.
Yeah, there's only 2 that I know of now. There's one down in Goleta called cultured abalone, and then there's one up in Monterey. It's Trevor Fay. His father, Raymond Fay, was the first scientist on the Coastal Commission. He was a very dear friend of ours.
Are you familiar with fishing of abalone off the Oregon coast? I was cruising up Highway 1 and stopped at a place, a cove, and there was rock. Guy came with a load of abalones. I'm not sure if they were reds or blacks or what, and said you could dive for them out there. It was only a few years ago.
Yeah, well, it's the red abalone do occur in Oregon. Yes, it's kind of the northern cline, so they thin out. But the big ones are up in Northern California. I mean, the really big ones. But it's more difficult diving too up there because of the weather.
I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about Glenn Bickford and the film that you were
involved with. It's called the Abalone Capital of the World.
Oh, yes. Yes. Glenn Bickford was another Midwesterner. It's kind of interesting how many young men came out during the Depression era and settled on the coast here and started diving abalone, farm boys. And Glenn Bickford was from Morro Bay. He came out in the late 30s, started diving, and he was a photographer. So he and Al Hansen would go around to war surplus after the war, buy cameras that were on fighter planes and the lenses. And they started doing underwater movies. This was before Jacques Cousteau. They were doing underwater movies. I've got some of them. They're really beautiful. Some are even in color. And a couple of years ago, I was working with Lori Mather out in Morro Bay. She did a film about Morro Bay abalone fishing. The very beautiful DVD. It's about 37 minutes, I think. I donated one to the museum here, but I think you can still get them at the Maritime Museum, Morro Bay. But it's very well done. It's about the history of Morro Bay, abalone fishery, and using a lot of Glenn Bickford's photos. Now, in my book, I used quite a lot of the photos from Glenn's collection. Before he died, he gave me several hundred photos. And then after he passed, his niece called me and she said, "We just found a bunch of Uncle Glenn's photo albums if you'd like to come by." And she gave me those. And I'm currently working with a gentleman down in Santa Barbara who did a PBS series called West of the West about the Channel Islands. It's a 3-part series. It's available from PBS or online. But where he's got my photos, he's been scanning those photos. I probably have a couple thousand images. They're all beautiful black and white glossy prints. Part of the reasons that we did the book was these photos had never been seen and likely never to be seen. And I've talked to the museum here about donating the collection some point in the future. And this would be a wonderful place for them since a lot of it is local. But in the book, we have photos of the whole processing from beginning to end, unloading the boat. There's a picture of George Clementis's boat in the book, and that's the one I was learning heavy gear diving as a teenager on that same boat. So the boat's on the back of what's now called Giovanni's, and that was Breb's Ocean House back then. And so they'd offload, bring them in, punch them out of the shell, put them on the settling table overnight, and then process them, slice them, pound them. And Frank Brebs was the one that came up with a wax box for them. I've got a few of those beautiful boxes in my collection. But, there's a lot of inventions that were developed around here. I mentioned Bob Kirby earlier. He went into business with Bev Morgan, another former diver, abalone diver, and they started the Kirby Morgan Corporation. They're down near the airport in Santa Maria these days. They're the leading helmet builder and designer in the world. Navies, military, construction, all over the world. Well, he used to come over to our house and use my dad's oxyacetylene welding equipment. And my dad would come home and he'd go, "Has that Kirby been over here again?" I go, "Yeah, he was here all day Saturday, Dad. Doggone it, he used up all my oxygen again." But he learned how to weld. He learned how to weld in the Navy, but he perfected it in our garage when I was a little kid, and went on to design the best diving equipment in the world.
Steve, I've known you a long time, and you always talk about Laddie Handelman. And can you tell us more about how he invented certain helmets and how he did deep sea diving for treasures and all that stuff like that? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay. Yeah, he was a very interesting fellow. He died about 4 years ago in November 2020. And the next day I went in the hospital with congestive heart failure. Nothing directly related other than maybe the stress, because he was my longest friend. Tom and I have been friends a long time, but Laddie and I go back to when I was a child. But he's just one of those guys that was always thinking and doing the impossible. He broke his neck at Mammoth skiing back in 1985 and was in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the chest down. Didn't stop him. He just kept running his companies. And after he retired, they kept him on the board of directors to make sure he had insurance to pay for his medical because it's very expensive. But did you ever go to his home?
Yeah.
He bought this property. If you know where the TV station is in Santa Barbara, up on TV Hill, overlooks the city. Laddie bought 16 acres up on top. He bought that whole hilltop. And then he developed, I think it was about 8 lots they were going to build. Then he went back to the city and he said, I changed my mind. I don't want 8, I want 5. Well, he was such a character and he is so shrewd. They figured, what's he up to now? What's he doing? Well, he said, I just, if we had 5, they'd just be nicer. Oh, okay. So they built 5 pads and 5 houses. But he had the house right up there on the top of the promontory. He always flew the flag every day, American flag. There was one year that there was a submarine came into Santa Barbara and parked right outside the harbor. And the crew and the captain from the submarine came up to his house and they said, we saw your flag and it looks a little tattered. And we bought you a brand new one if you'd allow us to, run it up the flagpole. And he goes, well, I can't do it, but if you'll do the honors, have at it. They did the whole thing. They had the gun salute and the whole deal, man. It was wonderful. But he's just that kind of guy. And he'd worked in the North Sea when they were developing the oil over in Norway. And just nothing could stop the guy. I mentioned earlier about their 400-foot dive off of Santa Barbara. There's 1,200-foot working dives these days on mixed gas. What they do is they take the nitrogen out of the gas and replace it with helium. And one of the other fellows developed a manifold where when they were on the oil platform or on the boat, they would adjust the air mix as the diver was descending, just the ratios of helium and the other gases. And then when they would ascend, they reverse it. Very sophisticated stuff, but all these guys that started this were former abalone divers from this part of the coast. It's quite an interesting group.
Hyperbaric chamber story?
Hyperbaric chambers.
How the hyperbaric chamber was used by Laddie's ex-wife when she was.
Oh, yeah, that was
recovering from a stroke.
No, it was she'd had brain surgery, and Laddie was also he's credited with introducing hyperbaric medicine to the United States, and there was a period of time where things were declining in the oil patch, and there was a lot of equipment available just sitting around. So people were taking it and putting it in their garages and any place they could store it. So we were down at Mandalay Bay one year with friends' parents visiting, and they had a chamber, which is about half the size of this room. And I was the only person there that wasn't wearing wool. I was wearing cotton. And so you have to be careful around oxygen because it's flammable. And so I was in the chamber with Laddie's former wife. She'd had brain surgery and couldn't hear. So I had to go in there with her and signal to her how to clear your ears and, adjust as you're descending, because every 33 feet that you go down, whether in a chamber, under pressure, or underwater, the atmospheric pressure doubles. So they took us down to about 4 atmospheres, which is about 120 feet of pressure in this chamber. Well, those things now, I was looking, the only one, there used to be one here in San Luis Obispo, it's down in Avila Beach now, but there is one in the county. How are you doing, Thomas?
We are good. Does anybody have any final questions? We've had a really great conversation. I think I want to lead the gratitude for the phenomenal evening. Do we have maybe 1 or 2 last questions?
I just have a quick, Tim Thomas is maybe on Zoom, and he's the co-author of the book, and I don't know if he's had a comment or not, but
I have been keeping an eye out for questions in the chat, and
Okay.
I can even come over here where maybe the chatters, the Zoomers will be able to hear. If there's any final questions, we're certainly not trying to cut anything short, but we want to make sure that we're sending people out into the lovely evening. Maybe go have a nice dinner in downtown SLO.
Yeah, I had invited Tim Thomas, my co-author from Monterey, if he wanted to call in and say anything about the book and about the section about Monterey. He's 4th generation Monterey. But I didn't hear from him, so apparently not. But thank you, Thomas.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. And just a quick plug here. We are so happy to be able to offer events like this for free for our community, but we really do. We are a nonprofit. We rely on the generosity of our community. So if you feel like we've earned a donation, we would be really proud to receive a donation. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do still have 3 copies of Steve's book available for sale. I'll be here touring that up. If there's more than that, I have an order in, and so we'll be able to get that backed up. Thank you all for joining us. If you did miss anything, or if you would like to see the recording, it should have it up by early next week. I'm going to stop the recording here.